My name is Anna Blue, and I just wanted to start this documentary off with a little story. Last spring, in March of 2012, I traveled to Istanbul, Turkey on a photography expedition with my family. In Istanbul, I found a vibrant culture, a smiling people, and the most delicious kebabs that I've ever tasted. I explored the city's streets, shivered in awe at the historical treasures of the Ottoman Empire, heard the tinkling of sweet tea carts as they rolled down cobblestone streets, and drowned myself in the vivid colors that covered streets and stores in the Grand Bazaar. Yet the thing that I was most struck by was the overwhelming happiness of the city, a hub for commerce between the East and the West, and a major stopping point on the now extinct Silk Road. All trip long, I was caught between two conflicting feelings: shock at the modernity and freedom of Turkey, and ashamed that I had assumed it would be any different just because it was a country of the Middle East. I had to remind myself every morning that Turkey was a democracy, and a good one at that. But my very last night, sitting in a small cafe settled in between a hookah bar and a silk scarf shop, I had one of the most provocative and stimulating conversations of my life, and one that perfectly represented for me the contradictions that characterize Turkey's dark past. It started when my Turkish waiter casually asked me a few questions about President Barack Obama. How did the American people like him? How was life in the White House? What did he drink every morning, coffee or tea? Or was he even a Starbucks man? I answered them all with surprise, and in response, he went on to describe how much he openly disliked Abdullah Gül, Turkey's president, for the fact that he was trying to Islamicize Turkey and rid the government of secularism. He was humorous in his entire discussion, talking carefreely about his opinion. I loved that he was so open and that he felt comfortable voicing his opinion against the government, so I decided to ask him about something that had been plaguing me since day one of the trip. I carelessly asked him, "What do you think the Turkish government is going to do about the Armenian genocide now?" The waiter, a man who had been smiling warmly all night long, turned deathly pale, grabbed me by the arm, and took me behind the bar. He whispered, "Don't say that ever again." At my startled face, he explained, "You can't mention that ever, or you might go to jail. Promise me you won't, especially here in the restaurant." So I promised him, and then I quickly escaped the restaurant. Since then, I've consistently questioned my knowledge and my perspective on the Armenian genocide. My curiosity has led me to research and to talk with my peers. Yet I reached a striking conclusion this past year. Not many people even know about the Armenian genocide. I don't blame them, though. The Armenian genocide is what you may call one of the biggest cover-ups of all time. According to Foreign Policy Journal writer Rafi Hovhannisyan, what befell the Armenian nation in 1915 was more than genocide, more than Holocaust. It was not only the premeditated taking of human lives, it was the collective murder of a nation, a culture, a civilization, and a time-honored way of life. So then the question remains, why does no one know? And furthermore, what can we do to bring much needed justice and peace to the wary Armenian people?
Years later, when Hitler was hatching the plan of exterminating European Jews, his advisors had said to him, you can't get away with this because public opinion will not allow it. And he had said, forget about public opinion. Who today talks about the Armenians? So essentially saying, the world forgets this.
In his statement regarding the tragedy that befell the Armenian population in Turkey, American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire Henry Morgenthau claimed, "I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared with the sufferings of the Armenian race in 1915. Morgenthau was certainly not wrong. For many historians, today the Armenian genocide represents the first in a series of deadly modern genocides, characterized by their systematic approach to killing under the advent of total war. The Armenians are a very ancient people. They were the first to adopt Christianity as the official state religion in 301 CE, and as a result, their deep Christian roots have caused their isolation from their Islamic neighbors as of late. The religious difference was an immediate and direct source of tension between the Ottoman Empire and its Christian subjects, even before the massacres started in the early 20th century. Under the Sultan's 19th century rule, the Armenians were treated as second-class citizens of the empire, facing discriminatory taxation policies and repressive legal restrictions. In the late 1800s, small groups of Armenian intellectuals rallied behind their ethnic cause and encouraged government implementation of the 1878 Treaty of Berlin. The Treaty of Berlin replaced the Treaty of San Stefano, ending the role of Russia in protecting the minority Armenians and establishing the Sultan as the ultimate voice on Armenian affairs. The Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, otherwise known as the Bloody Sultan, refused to give the Armenian protesters the equal rights they asked for and resorted to massacres of the dissenters. Abdul Hamid organized thousands of Kurdish people, an Ottoman Empire minority similarly persecuted by the Turkish peoples, into mobile killing units and used their dissatisfaction at their minority status against the Armenians. The massacres, the worst of which took place between 1894 and 1896, came to be known as the Hamidian Massacres and resulted in the deaths of around 300,000 Armenians. Historians now see the Hamidian massacres as not only a foreshadowing of the genocide in 1915, but as evidence of the paranoia of the Ottoman state. Abdul Hamid II claimed that the massacre of his own citizens was legitimate because the Turkish Armenians were a threat to the security of the state. Peace and security finally arrived for the Armenians, or so they thought, in 1908 when the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan after a march into the heart of Constantinople. The Young Turks were a group of patriotic reformers that instigated a revolutionary movement against Abdul Hamid's regime. The movement was originally formed by a group of resentful liberal soldiers in the Third Army Corps in Macedonia that formed the Ottoman Liberty Society in 1908 to stimulate progressive discussion. The group espoused the ideals of the French Revolution and established a constitutional government for the empire. In 1913, the stability of the constitutional government was briefly threatened by the takeover of a now infamous triumvirate, that of Talat Pasha, Ahmed Cemal Pasha, and Enver Pasha. The three men, very nationalistic and conservative members of the Young Turk movement, marched into Sublime Porte on January 26, 1913, killed the Ottoman Minister of War, and established their new government, the Committee of Union and Progress. Under the Committee of Union and Progress, the Ottoman Empire flourished. The group encouraged industrialization, greater rights for women, and secularization of the legal system. Yet, the respectable policies of the CUP in the domestic arena will forever be overshadowed by the disaster that their government sponsored and oversaw in Anatolia in 1915. As a result of the extremely nationalistic policies of the new government and the distrustful chaos that consumed Europe prior to the outbreak of World War I, the progressive attitude of the Young Turks was soon replaced by an intensely conservative agenda of Turkification. The aggressive and violent policy pursued by the new government was motivated by the Ottoman Empire's image as the sick man of Europe, as a result of their loss of territory in the Greco-Turkish War leading to the Turkish evacuation of Crete in 1898 and the disastrous Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. For example, Talat, Enver, and Cemal introduced the Association for the Promotion of Turkish Strength, an organization that was dedicated to preventing the supposed decay of the Turkish race and mandated language Turkification. In addition, the CUP created the clandestine special organization under the leadership of Eshraf Kushkabashi to oversee important external or internal security concerns. The special organization, though, evolved into a sort of secret police that terrorized the Armenian minorities in the name of Ottoman security. The Armenians were increasingly seen as a security concern starting in 1914, when the empire's decline was quickened by their entry into World War I in alliance with Germany and Austria. The empire was in no state to fight nor defend themselves, and by consequence the Turkish army suffered a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Russians on the Ottoman-Russian border in the winter of 1914. The Armenians, many of whom lived close to the border with Russia, transformed into internal enemies that were helping the Russians defeat the Turks. Desperate to keep control and maintain the stability of the faltering Ottoman Empire, the Committee of Union and Progress resorted to desperate measures. Talat Pasha, in a conversation with the American ambassador in 1915, revealed how the Ottoman Empire had decided to resort to severe action against the Armenians, saying, "The Turkish Empire has dwindled almost to the vanishing point. If what was left of Turkey was to survive, we must get rid of these alien people." The triumvirate met in a confidential CUP meeting in January 1915, where many historians believe they formalized their plans for the extermination of the Armenians. At the meeting, a secret 10-point statement was issued, which gave the orders to apply all measures to exterminate Armenian males under 50, priests and teachers, and leave the girls and the children to be Islamicized. The decision to rid Turkey of the Armenians was also motivated by religious differences. Talat declared early on in his rule with the CUP that equality between Muslims and the infidels, or the Armenians, was unrealizable. In May 1915, Talat ordered the deportation of thousands of Armenians across Anatolia, using an army of 12,000 criminals released from jail and dubbed the Army of Murderers to force the innocent people from their homes. If the Armenians did not comply with the order, they were taken to court and executed. Next, the CUP created the temporary law, which made legal the ability of the government to expropriate the property of the Armenian deportees. This new law encouraged the local common Turkish people to get involved in the persecution of the Armenians. If the Armenians were removed from their homes or gotten rid of, the locals were rewarded with a new house to raid and pillage. Unfortunately, considering the pitiable economic state of Turkey in 1915, many Turkish people lived in poverty, and their desperation only intensified the killing and pillaging of helpless Armenians and their homes. While the special organization organized discreet killings of the Armenian leaders and intellectuals in the cities, the Armenians were murdered in mass numbers in rural Anatolia, out of the view of the international community and under the cover of war. The German ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Wolf Metternich, perfectly characterized what took place in the Armenian genocide, saying to the German government, "For the CUP, Turkification means license to expel, to kill, or destroy everything that is not Turkish." The Young Turk regime fell in October of 1918 at the end of World War I, terminating their vicious acts of persecution against minorities. According to expert director of the Genocidal Studies program at Yale, Ben Kiernan, the advent of totalitarianism offered prospective genocidists not only the cover and ideological rationale for their crimes, but unprecedented efficiency and tempting feasibility. In 1876, there were a recorded 2.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. By 1918, at the end of the Armenian Genocide, 1.2 million of them, mostly innocent and loyal citizens of the Turkish state, were dead.
So, have you guys ever heard of the Armenian Genocide before? No. Have you ever heard of the Armenian Genocide? No, you haven't? So, have you ever heard of the Armenian Genocide before? No. So, have you ever heard of the Armenian genocide before?
So I've heard you and Christine talk about it for class, but I've never, formally read about it or anything, so no.
So, if 48% of the Armenian population in Turkey died during the Armenian genocide, why does no one know about it? Why does it continue as an enigma despite the fact that it was one of the darkest moments in history?
So one morning, my grandfather is going, one Saturday, is going to the bazaar to buy peppers for his widowed sister-in-law who's going to pickle the peppers. Right? His shop is there, the store is there, and suddenly there is a disturbance, like there is a signal, and this mob or a group of people attack him, and his own butcher cuts his throat, and the body is never recovered, and they take his keys, go and loot his store.
One problem that causes the lack of awareness is the generally uninformed attitude of much of the international community with regards to Turkey. Turkish history is a foreign concept to so many people.
When you think of Turkey, what is the first thing you think of?
Thanksgiving.
The country, Turkey.
Turkey.
Yeah.
Hey, what's up, Andrew?
I said terrorists, but that's not a good one. Alright.
So,
Alright, Turkey. Go ahead.
relationship
Reset.
thing is like
Okay,
as far as,
Turkey.
romantic
Istanbul.
involvement.
Istanbul. Okay, good one. Yeah.
So is she free?
Andrew. Shh. Sorry. Just for a second. Sorry. Oh, okay. So so have you ever studied or heard of, okay, when you think of Turkey, what is the first thing you think of?
Thanksgiving.
The country, Turkey.
Turkey. I said terrorists, but that's not a good
Students are generally unaware of the Armenian genocide, but it's not a lack of genocide knowledge in general that plagues many students. Instead, it tends to be an issue with the Armenian genocide in particular.
Why do you think nobody knows about the Armenian genocide?
Well, basically, I think one of the biggest factors about the Armenian genocide is that it happened so close in the timeline to the Holocaust, and I feel like that was eclipsed completely by the Holocaust.
So, when you guys first think of Germany, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? When you guys think of Turkey, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Turkish ice cream.
Thanksgiving.
The country of Turkey. Okay, so just in general, when you think about Germany, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Really, honestly,
Yeah.
Nazis
Okay.
and beer.
Beer's always good. Okay, when you think about Turkey, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
It's the middle, but it's like between Europe and Asia.
Okay, that's really
Actually,
cool.
They're really good friends with Korea. Whatever.
The largest reason that it evades public consciousness today is that the Turkish government refuses to formally acknowledge the killing as a genocide. They accept that many Armenians were killed, but they attribute the deaths to casualties of war. Why do they not accept it as genocide?
Why do you think the Turks continue to deny it? Maybe for psychological reasons or historical reasons. Like, why do you believe they continue?
I think we should not think that the Turks are doing something that is peculiar. Turkey as a country is a relatively new country. If we're talking about the Turkish Republic, it was established only in 1923. So every country has certain myths of origin which represent a particular interpretation of history, which usually has a lot of romantic untruth mixed into it. So the Turkish Republic doesn't want to acknowledge that the events that resulted in the demise of the Ottoman Empire and created the possibility for the creation of the Turkish Republic include a genocide, because that would be insulting Turkishness, which is actually a crime in Turkey.
So why do you think the Turkish government continues to deny it today?
I think that with all massacre or mass atrocity denial stems from a lot of different factors, but I think with the Turkish government, it's basically revolved around the international relations. I know that Turkey's tried to get into the EU, and the things confronting this past is probably not in their best interest.
The Turkish government denial streams from a variety of psychological and political reasons. First of all, the Turkish Republic, as it exists now, has disconnected itself entirely from its Ottoman history because it doesn't want to be placed on the same stage as infamous figures like Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot. Turkey itself is proud of its recent modernization, as it is a relatively young country, and it does not want to damage its chance to have a major influence on the world stage. Yet, I would argue that Turkey would best gain the respect and admiration of the international community if it did own up to its past. As a country in denial, Turkey appears both oblivious and irresponsible towards its own Armenian citizens. One of the final reasons Turkey denies the genocide is because of the economic concerns that acknowledgement would bring. For example, acknowledgement would require the government to dole out millions of dollars in reparations to the descendants of the victims.
This country can afford not to know about what's going on somewhere else. I mean, it's not the idea of Fortress America, but in fact, unless, again, I think your generation and maybe the last 25, 50 years, this has changed, but Americans typically are quite ignorant of what goes on in the rest of the world.
As a result of the Turkish government denial, the Armenian genocide isn't properly covered in textbooks, it is avoided in scholarly debate, and most of all, the subject is avoided by the world society and its main players, the United States and the United Nations in particular. The United States, for instance, has struggled with formally acknowledging the truth because of the possibility of damaging diplomatic relations with one of their strongest Middle Eastern allies. Although Congress has repeatedly proposed the affirmation of the United States record on the Armenian Genocide Resolution, a law that would identify Turkey as guilty of genocide, the resolution has consistently been rejected by congressmen and especially by the State Department for fear of angering Turkey. For example, although President Obama continues to reassure angry Armenian Americans that the bill will be passed in order to bring justice to their Armenian ancestors, State Department Secretary Hillary Clinton repeatedly assures the Turkish government in kind that the resolution will never ever be considered. Contradictions within the United States government, depending on competing state interests, epitomize the inconsistency of the international community that has helped Turkey avoid dialogue on the subject. There is also huge foreign investment in Turkey, discouraging states or courts from taking legal action against the country, and there always has been that huge foreign investment. For instance, directly after the Armenian genocide, France owned about 70% of Ottoman security assets, and their economic interest in Turkey's success encouraged many in the government to turn a blind eye to the genocide.
The circumstances that permit international action are problematic because powers will only intervene when it's otherwise in their interest to do so, in addition to whatever human rights.
Under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the killing of the Armenians constitutes genocide because it was committed with the intent to destroy the ethnic group. Not only was intent to kill demonstrated by the harsh standards that the Armenians lived in, but it was also demonstrated by the harsh standards of the deportation they were forced into. The deportation was used as means to isolate the Armenians and turn them into, unfortunately, easy victims. One major defense put forward by the Turkish government is the argument that the deportation was used as means of security to stabilize the Russian border during the war, and that any deaths that resulted from the harsh conditions of deportation were not the intent of the government. Yet then how do they explain that in the summer of 1916, Turkish forces admitted to massacring another 200,000 Armenians in the Mesopotamian desert after the deportation? There is no doubt in my mind that what happened to the Armenians constitutes genocide, and I believe it's time that we change the passive mindset of the international community. Many people are skeptical about my goal. They say that what happened almost 100 years ago is a thing of the past, that it should be forgotten, not remembered. But how can the Armenian genocide be forgotten when the social and economic consequences of the massacres continue to infiltrate Turkish society today? The Armenians are a lost people, scattered around the world in a variety of places as a result of the killing. I'm not saying that we can fix everything, but I think we need to start first by raising awareness. People should know what happened. The Armenians deserve the formal apology of the Turkish government so that they are no longer haunted by the genocide and by the world's shameful silence.
It's a question of knowing what happened and having a realistic appreciation based on that.
Türk cumhuriyeti Yemeni soykırımı inkar ediyor.
Some Armenians will not even go to Turkey because they would say, we can't stand going to Turkey. Well, I and other Armenians, I don't know where we have the drawing line, my feeling is I am not going to hate this Turkish child because his great-grandfather called my great-grandfather. I mean, this is not, there is something called collective responsibility, but you have to be reasonable about it. So I think, there has to be an acknowledgement of what happened because the wound will not heal until that story is told.
Yeah.